The hose was hissing again. At first, I thought it was just the wind catching the line, but at 11:47 p.m., under a full moon and a sky that looked like it was holding its breath, I realized something far weirder was going on. My water bill had doubled. The HOA had banned all daytime watering. And yet somehow, Karen's garden looked like it belonged on the cover of Better Homes and Hypocrisy. I leaned back in my patio chair, nachos in one hand, binoculars in the other, and whispered to myself, "This woman is about to learn what happens when you mess with someone who grew up with 3 brothers, a toolkit, and a petty streak longer than Route 66. It all started innocently enough, or at least as innocently as things can start in a neighborhood run by a woman whose license plate literally reads, "Rule as one." Karen wasn't just the HOA president, she was the self-appointed landscaping overlord of Elmwood Estates. The kind of person who measured grass height with a ruler and once issued a $50 fine because someone's Halloween pumpkin lingered into November. But for all her rules, something about her perfect garden just didn't add up. The whole community had been put under water restrictions after the 3rd warning from the city. We were told to limit watering to twice a week, and only during early morning hours. The rest of us complied. My lawn went from suburban green to crunchy bays within days. But Karen's? Lush. Vibrant. Her hydrangeas were glowing like they'd been blessed by some plant god, while the rest of ours resembled rejected salad toppings. I didn't notice the water bill at first. It was a little high, sure, but summer rates always creep up. It wasn't until I got a late notice claiming I owed triple my usual amount that I started digging, literally. I walked the property line looking for leak. Nothing. Checked the irrigation timer. Called the water company. No sir, no error. Consumption is correct. That's when I spotted it. My hose line didn't quite coil the way I'd left it. I stared at the end of it. Someone had added a splitter, and one end snaked through the hedge, into Karen's backyard. I stood there, slack-jawed. The woman had literally tapped into my water supply like some suburban pirate. It wasn't even clever, just bold. And illegal. But what really set me off wasn't just the theft. It was the hypocrisy. This was the same woman who cited me for unauthorized wind chimes, because they didn't match my house paint. The same woman who once rang my doorbell at 6:12 a.m. to let me know that my garbage can had been visible from the street. She stole my water while enforcing the very rule she broke. And she thought I wouldn't notice? Now, I could have gone straight to the HOA board. But considering Karen ran it like a miniature dictatorship, complete with monthly newsletters and color-coded compliance charts, that would have gone nowhere fast. Instead, I decided to watch. That night, I brought out the lawn chair, some chips, and a GoPro taped to a tiki torch. I waited. And just like a raccoon who's memorized your trash day, Karen struck. She appeared out of the darkness like a polyester ghost, wearing matching gloves and visor, dragging a section of hose under a gnome and into her own garden. She clipped it to a hidden drip system like she'd done it 100 times. Didn't even look around. That smug, HOA presidential confidence radiated off her like cheap sunscreen. I watched, stunned and a little impressed. The woman had turned my water into her own private reservoir. I checked the timestamp. 11:47 p.m. She probably had it scheduled like a hit job. I didn't sleep that night. Not out of rage, but inspiration. I woke up with an idea that had just the right amount of petty, creative, and screw you. The next day, I drove to a hardware store 2 towns over. The kind where no one asks why you're buying vinegar in bulk. I grabbed industrial blue clothing dye, 3 bottles of dish soap, a few garden-grade check valves, and a glitter-infused car wash additive. If Karen wanted to tap into my line, she was going to get everything I gave her. Literally. I got to work like a mad scientist. I set up a pressure-safe garden sprayer and backfed the concoction into her stolen line late at night. I even put a discreet note next to the hose. Do not touch, decorative. Just in case she got nosy. The next morning was a thing of beauty. I wasn't outside, but I heard it. The scream. That high-pitched, HOA-issued shriek that echoed across fences and hit my ears like victory music. I ran to the window. Karen stood in her garden, holding up a once white rose that now looked like it had been dipped in a Smurf latte. Her flowerbed was a mess of bright blue petals, foam, and a glittery sheen that shimmered like toxic unicorn tears. Her face was twisted in a mix of rage, disbelief, and horror. I took a sip of my coffee and waved. She didn't wave back. Later that day, she came stomping to my door, dragging her hose like a wounded snake. "What did you do?" she shouted, holding up a blue-stained gardening glove. "My flowers. My soil smells like vinegar and dawn." I tilted my head like I was hearing this for the first time. "That's odd. My hose has been acting funny too. Maybe someone's been messing with it." She opened her mouth, ready to spit fire, but stopped. Because she knew. She knew I knew. And more importantly, I wasn't scared. "I'm filing a complaint," she hissed. "With who?" "You," I asked with a smile. Her eye twitched. "This isn't over." She stormed off, trailing sparkles in her wake. And that's when I knew. I hadn't just started a prank. I had declared war. And in Elmwood Estates the only rule was, don't mess with the quiet neighbor who owns 3 cameras, a chemistry set, and nothing left to lose. She thought the blue roses were the worst of it. She had no idea what was coming next. Karen didn't say a word for 2 whole days. Not a scowl. Not a sideways glance. Not even one of her usual passive-aggressive sticky notes disguised as community reminders. Her yard, however, told a different story. The once pristine rows of white roses now looked like they'd been tie-dyed by an angry toddler. Foam still clung to some of the petals like soap suds that refused to die. Her prized petunias had taken on a frothy, seafoam tint, while her hydrangeas, once a delicate pale lavender, were now electric blue with just a hint of glitter catching the sunlight like the aftermath of a very unholy unicorn sneeze. It was beautiful. Horrific, but beautiful. And it meant one thing: my plan had worked perfectly. I half expected her to retaliate immediately, maybe with a fine or one of her carefully crafted neighborhood-wide emails full of vague threats disguised as moral outrage. Instead, she went quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that made you check over your shoulder when watering your own lawn, even if you weren't technically allowed to. I knew Karen wasn't done. She was plotting. But so was I. What she didn't know was that my blue and foamy garden cocktail had been the mild version. The beta test. I'd gone light on the vinegar and skipped the gelatin and glitter the first time, just in case I needed room to escalate. But now that I had a taste of vengeance and knew she was still tapping into my line, it was time to go full gourmet. The next morning, while sipping coffee and watching her scrub her hose with lemon juice and what looked like holy water, I started mixing my newest creation. Vinegar and soap remained the base, but I added cornstarch this time for extra gunk, a generous splash of beet juice for that reddish-brown, this plant might be bleeding effect, and a different, more aggressive blue dye meant for heavy denim. And of course, glitter, cosmetic-grade, biodegradable, but wildly effective at making anything it touches look like a disco accident. I hooked everything up to the same pressurized backfeed system and let it rip at 2 a.m. By the time the sun came up, I was already waiting near my living room window like a kid on Christmas morning. Right on cue, Karen emerged in her garden gear, hose in hand, completely unaware that she was about to paint her own backyard like a Jackson Pollock reject. She twisted the spigot. A faint fizzing noise followed. Then came the shriek. This time, it wasn't just her flowers. The foamy mess sprayed out in multiple directions, coating her gloves, her shoes, and somehow her cat, which darted across the yard with a sparkly blue tail. Her garden looked like a crime scene from a children's book. I could hear her stomping and shouting from inside, muttering things like chemical warfare and "you'll pay for this" over the sound of her flower pots toppling over. A neighbor from across the street, one of the quieter ones who normally avoided the HOA drama, peeked out from their curtain, saw the blue carnage, and immediately ducked back inside. The only thing missing was dramatic background music. Of course, Karen couldn't take it lying down. By sunset, she called an emergency HOA board meeting, citing deliberate horticultural sabotage. The irony was so thick I could spread it on toast. I knew she would try to spin it. What I didn't expect was just how unhinged she'd get. She gathered the board under her pergola, which had recently been adorned with tarps to hide her Technicolor flora, and launched into a full-blown conspiracy rant. She claimed someone had tampered with community water systems, accused me directly, without evidence, of course, and even hinted that I might be in violation of federal environmental codes. I wasn't invited to the meeting, but I didn't need to be. One of the board members, a soft-spoken retiree named Phil, had already begun sliding into accidental whistleblower territory. He'd seen the hose setup. He'd heard Karen mention borrowing water from neighbors during a wine-soaked HOA mixer. And now, thanks to her latest meltdown, he was officially over it. That night, he left an anonymous envelope on my doorstep. Inside were printed minutes from previous HOA meetings and a handwritten note that said, "We're sick of her too. Keep going." I laughed so hard I nearly choked on my celebratory gummy worms. This wasn't just revenge anymore. This was becoming a movement. If even her loyal board was starting to defect, it meant I was winning. I spent the rest of the night drafting my next move. I didn't want to destroy her garden, I wanted to destroy her credibility. And nothing would do that better than public embarrassment. 2 days later, my chance came. Karen had decided to host a garden showcase event for the neighborhood. Her yard, while still recovering from its last blue bath, had been hastily replanted and covered in decorative burlap to hide the stained soil. She even brought in potted plants from a nursery and pretended they were hers. It was the kind of fraud that only Karen could deliver with a smile and a tray of cucumber sandwiches. I attended, of course, armed with nothing but polite smiles and a GoPro hidden inside a decorative lawn gnome. As she gave the tour, I waited for her to reach the irrigation station. That's what she called the hose area now, as if rebranding it gave her theft some kind of legitimacy. She bragged about her efficient use of community resources, completely unaware that the gnome sitting by her feet was filming the entire charade. I didn't say a word. I just nodded, complimented her water-smart flowers, and left. That night, I uploaded the video anonymously to the local neighborhood Facebook group and, for good measure, cross-posted it to Reddit's r/EntitledPeople. I added timestamps and circled the stolen splitter setup in red. Within hours, it exploded. Comments poured in. People recognized her voice, her garden, her smug tone. It was glorious. The best part? Someone from the local news station saw the clip and reached out to the HOA for a statement. Karen tried to go on the offensive again, sending out an all-caps email accusing online trolls of spreading misinformation. But it was too late. The tide had turned. Neighbors were talking. A few even confessed that they, too, had mysteriously high water bills and suspiciously moist lawns. Karen had been using her secret hose network on more than just my spigot. And yet, somehow, she still didn't back down. She doubled down. She started planting more. Right along the fence line, where her vines began to creep onto my property. This was war, and it was only getting uglier. But what she didn't know, what she could never imagine, was that I had something bigger planned. Something that wouldn't just turn her flowers blue, it would turn the entire HOA against her. Karen's silence didn't last long. After her glitter-coated disaster garden made rounds across the neighborhood Facebook group, she switched tactic. Less screaming, more scheming. That's when I noticed the first vine creeping under my fence. At first glance, it looked harmless, just some leafy green tendril poking through the slats. But by the end of the week, my fence had a full-blown wall of creeping vines crawling up its sides like it was auditioning for a horror movie. I tried trimming them back, but they returned overnight twice as thick. Her new approach was clear. If she couldn't beat me with fines or exposure, she'd drown me in foliage. I walked the fence line with my phone out, snapping photos of where the vines had wrapped around my solar lights, choked my rosemary bush, and were now steadily inching toward my patio grill. On Karen's side, she had planted what looked like an entire row of decorative climbers, but I recognized them immediately. Kudzu. The plant equivalent of a zombie outbreak. Once it gets going, it devours everything. It doesn't care about property lines. It doesn't stop at fences. And worst of all, it grows insanely fast. Of course, she didn't get HOA approval to plant it. That would require accountability, and Karen's idea of accountability was everyone else being accountable to her. I emailed the HOA, including pictures, timestamps, and a lovely PDF titled, "The Vine Invasion, a Cautionary Tale." The response came back in record time, 15 minutes flat. But instead of support, I received a politely worded dismissal stating that the vines were aesthetic and non-threatening and, more importantly, not visible from the street. That last part had become their favorite line lately. Apparently, if a problem couldn't be seen by passing cars, it simply didn't exist. I almost admired the loophole logic. Almost. That same day, a small Amazon box appeared at my doorstep. No return address, no note, just a neatly wrapped package. Inside was a portable moisture meter, a USB stick, and a bag of organic glitter. Taped to the bottom was a sticky note in barely legible cursive. "Keep pushing. She's cracking. P." I knew immediately who it was from. Phil, the soft-spoken HOA board member turned unlikely ally. He had become my inside man, quietly funneling me tidbits from behind enemy lines. He'd already tipped me off about the emergency board meetings Karen was holding in secret and even slipped me a draft of a proposed neighborhood horticultural ethics clause she was pushing to pass. It read like a passive-aggressive manifesto. If it hadn't been so outrageous, it would have been hilarious. But now it was time to push back. Again. I revisited my hose sabotage setup, upgrading the components like I was tuning a race car. This time, I used a thicker mixture. Half water, half gelatinous beet juice, a squirt of blue detergent, and just a dash of banana extract to add a lingering stench that wouldn't show up immediately. It was a petty masterpiece. I fed it into the hose at dawn while she was still asleep, then waited. When the sun rose, Karen came out with her usual smug determination. She pulled the hose over, twisted the spigot, and like clockwork, the goo shot out. The consistency was perfect. Too thick to flow easily, just thick enough to clog everything it touched. The moment it hit her begonias, the mixture began to bubble, not from any chemical reaction, but because I'd added a fizzy bath bomb core to the line. Her flowers frothed like they were being sacrificed in a witch's cauldron. The smell hit next, sweet and weirdly tropical. Karen gagged. Her cat screamed. And I sipped my coffee behind the curtain, resisting the urge to slow clap. The best part? The goo stuck to everything. The glitter embedded itself into the mulch, the banana scent clung to her gloves, and her precious hose looked like it had been used to clean a smoothie blender. I could hear her cursing up a storm, each word more unhinged than the last. She kicked over a planter, tripped on a stone rabbit, and let out a guttural screech that echoed through the neighborhood. That's when I noticed the camera flash from across the street. One of the neighbors was filming her meltdown. And judging by the grin on their face, I wasn't the only one enjoying the show. Still, Karen wouldn't go down easily. That evening, she made her boldest move yet. She marched up to my front door, glitter still clinging to her forearms, and slapped a bright pink citation on my mailbox. It was hand-typed, laminated, and signed with a flourish. The offense? Conduct unbecoming of a homeowner. I read it twice, then burst out laughing. It was completely fabricated. No HOA rule number, no references. Just a statement of pure, righteous fury wrapped in legal-sounding nonsense. I posted a photo of it online, of course, and once again, it spread like wildfire. The neighborhood page was now full of memes. Someone photoshopped Karen into a fairy, sprinkling glitter over unsuspecting homes. Another turned her into a villain in a fake trailer called The Hose Wars. One of the best comments read, "Plot twist, Karen waters her flowers with spite." Behind the scenes, Phil was gathering support to call a vote to remove her as HOA president. He needed a majority, but the tide was turning in our favor. He let me know there were only two holdouts: neighbors who were terrified of Karen's wrath or just didn't want to get involved. That meant I needed to go bigger. Not just petty or clever. I needed evidence that would make her position utterly indefensible. So I did the only thing I could. I hired a professional landscape inspector. Not to look at her flowers, but at the invasive vines. Turns out, part of the fence line she planted on overlapped a stretch of protected greenbelt buffer land. Which meant those vines weren't just ugly, they were illegal. The inspector wrote up a detailed report, complete with photographs, measurements, and violations. And the best part? He CC'd the city. Karen had crossed the line. Literally. I didn't even have to say anything. When the city letter arrived at her door, she screamed so loudly the neighbor's dog started howling. She stormed to the HOA office, which was really just her converted garage, and slammed the door hard enough to rattle the fake ivy hanging above it. Now, with official city attention on her vines and the neighborhood rallying behind me, Karen was on the defensive. Her power, once unshakable, was eroding with every new blue flower and viral meme. She tried to call an emergency meeting, but this time, no one showed up. Phil told me she sat in her folding chair, alone, surrounded by laminated complaint forms and a plate of untouched cucumber sandwiches. It was over. She just didn't know it yet. The letter from the city changed everything. Karen had always operated like she was untouchable, immune to rules because she was the one who wrote them. But when that bright yellow envelope showed up taped to her door with an official city seal and a very clear warning about invasive species encroaching on protected land, something in her snapped. She didn't scream this time. She didn't even argue. She just stood there, staring at it, her hands shaking, the paper fluttering in the wind like the last page in a bad script. She yanked it off the door, crumpled it without reading past the first sentence, and stomped back inside. The neighborhood watched in silence. Not out of fear, but anticipation. Everyone knew this was the beginning of the end. Later that day, I received a message from Phil. It was a screenshot of the upcoming HOA agenda, and the final item listed was, Board Vote, Removal of HOA President, Special Motion Filed. My stomach did a backflip. This was it. The moment we'd all been building toward. Karen's unraveling wasn't just theatrical anymore. It was documented, city-cited, and caught on camera more times than a YouTube prank channel. But I couldn't just rely on one vote and a city letter. I needed to make sure the fall was complete, undeniable, and impossible to cover up with one of her usual spin tactics. That's when I called in a favor. My cousin Joey worked for a local news station. He wasn't high up or anything. Just a guy who edited B-roll and occasionally ran the camera for minor community segments. But he owed me for helping him pass math in high school, and I was cashing in. I told him everything. The water theft, the glitter hose, the blue flower fiasco, the Facebook group circus, and now the official violation from the city. He didn't even blink. "You had me at blue flowers," he said. That weekend, the news van rolled into the neighborhood like it was covering a major crime scene. They kept it casual, nothing too flashy. Just a local community highlight, story about rising water bills and increasing neighborhood tensions over landscaping enforcement. But they interviewed me first, on my front lawn, standing next to the now-secured water spigot with a heavy-duty lock and a freshly installed camera pointed directly at it. I kept it polite but didn't hold back. I mentioned the spike in water bills, the unauthorized splitter, the mysterious hose creeping through the hedges, and the midnight watering sessions. I didn't say her name. I didn't have to. The visuals did all the work. Then they walked over to Karen's house. To her credit, she came out with a tray of lemon bars and a smile so fake it could have been printed. She welcomed them like she hadn't spent the last month terrorizing the community with garden sabotage and petty fines. She tried to steer the interview into talking about her award-winning roses and her commitment to HOA values, but the moment they asked about the city violation, her smile cracked. She fumbled. She blamed jealous neighbors and anonymous vandals, before storming off mid-interview when the reporter asked if she had any footage to back her claims. The piece aired that night. It was only 3 minutes long, but it lit the neighborhood up like a firecracker. People who hadn't cared one way or another suddenly had opinions. The quiet neighbors, the fence-sitters, even the guy on the corner who only came out to get mail in a bathrobe. Karen had finally done the one thing you can't do in a power-hungry HOA. She embarrassed herself in public. On the day of the vote, the meeting was packed. Not just board members, but regular residents who normally wouldn't touch an HOA meeting with a 10-foot rake. Some brought lawn chairs. One woman brought cookies. I brought the blue-glittered hose, coiled neatly in a clear bin labeled Exhibit A. Karen stood at the front, tight-lipped, arms crossed, surrounded by laminated rule books and folders she'd brought like they were legal weapons. But this time, no one was impressed. No one was intimidated. And Phil, sweet Phil, sat in the center chair like he'd been waiting his whole life for this. He opened the floor for discussion. Karen immediately launched into a speech. It was passionate, furious, and full of so many contradictions it could have been a sitcom monologue. She accused everyone of betrayal, claimed she was a pillar of order in a collapsing society, and actually used the phrase, "I am the HOA." When she finished, the silence was so deep you could hear someone pop a mint. Then Phil calmly looked at the board and asked for the vote. It wasn't even close. 8 in favor of removal. 1 abstention. 0 support. Karen looked around like she'd just been voted off an island. She demanded to know the names of everyone who voted against her. She accused Phil of staging a coup. She called me a sociopathic gardener, which, honestly, I didn't hate. And then, in true Karen fashion, she stood, grabbed her laminated rulebook, and stormed out, muttering something about getting lawyers and forming her own neighborhood association. As she walked past me, she paused. Her eyes locked on the blue hose in the bin. For a split second, I thought she might try to take it back, like it belonged to her. But she didn't. She just glared, shook her head, and kept walking. The room didn't erupt in cheers or clapping. It was quieter than that. Just a long, collective exhale. Like we'd all been holding our breath for too long and finally got to breathe. Phil took over as interim president. First order of business? Repealing several of Karen's most absurd rules, including the wind chime color mandate and the garbage can timing ordinance. Second order? Installing lockable spigots on all shared properties. Third? Hosting a block party called Water Wars, the ceasefire. I brought drinks. Karen's house grew quieter after that. The vines were removed. Her flowers faded. The once bustling command center of the HOA fell into stillness. A few weeks later, a for sale sign went up. The listing described it as a charming home with character and unique garden features. I almost bought it just for the poetic ending. But instead, I focused on my own yard. No more glitter. No more sabotage. Just peace. Every now and then, I'd look over at the hose lock, the camera blinking calmly, and the newly thriving, legitimately watered garden, and smile. Because for the first time in a long time, Elmwood Estates was quiet. And Karen? Karen had finally run out of water to steal. It was almost peaceful. For the first time in what felt like an entire season, my mornings weren't interrupted by the sounds of shrieking, hose sabotage, or surprise fines printed on neon paper. Karen's reign had ended, and the neighborhood had returned to something resembling sanity. The vines were gone. The HOA had adopted a tone that didn't make you feel like you were living under a dictatorship, and people actually waved to each other again without fear of being cited for unauthorized shrubbery. But just as I was getting used to my calm little bubble of post-Karen bliss, the final act unfolded. It began with the smell. It was subtle at first, a faint chemical tang in the air. Not offensive, not strong enough to cause alarm, just strange. Unnatural. Then came the puddle. A small, bluish smear creeping from the base of my side fence into the yard. I leaned over to inspect it and found the unmistakable traces of dye, faint glitter, and something else, a sour, vinegary edge that tickled the back of my throat. It wasn't just familiar. It was my own mix, my garden cocktail, the one I'd used on Karen months ago. Someone had poured it back into my yard. I followed the trail to its source. A broken piece of hose, still dripping, lay half-buried beneath a heap of soil right along the property line. It was the same hose Karen had once used to siphon my water. The blue stains, the residual soap bubbles, it was unmistakable. But this time, it hadn't been connected to my spigot. It had been used as a delivery system. Karen had tried to return fire one last time. Literally. In what I could only describe as a final act of spite, she had dumped a diluted version of the infamous mix into my flowerbeds, likely hoping to give me a taste of my own medicine. Unfortunately for her, the slope of our yards ran downhill. So when the mix had flowed out, gravity had done what gravity always does. It carried everything back into her own garden. By noon, the smell had intensified. A few neighbors began to notice, walking past and crinkling their noses. By early evening, her entire front yard looked like a melted snow cone. Patches of her freshly planted daisies were stained, wilted, and glistening with blue slime. Some of the foam had even bubbled up through the mulch. Whether she'd used too much water or simply didn't account for the backflow, the result was poetic justice. Her garden was once again a canvas of chaos. Phil called me later that day, chuckling. He said the HOA had received 3 complaints about unidentifiable dye runoff originating from Lot 14, which was Karen's property. They'd already sent someone to inspect it and, in a twist of delicious irony, issued her a formal citation for landscape contamination. Came with a fine. A steep one. Apparently, the new board had updated the landscaping code to include penalties for intentional chemical spreading without HOA clearance. The motion had passed unanimously. Karen didn't take it well. She was seen pacing on her lawn with a phone clutched to her ear, yelling into it with such fury you could hear the vibrations through the windows. A neighbor 2 houses down claimed she threatened to sue the HOA, the city, and possibly the Postal Service for delivering the fine in an aggressive envelope. The next morning, the for sale sign in her yard was tilted at an angry angle. By the end of the week, the listing had gone live online. The description was priceless, full of euphemisms like vibrant, artistic garden palette, and eco-conscious experimental landscaping. I couldn't resist. The same day her listing went up, I hosted a yard sale. I put out folding tables, signs, and a display labeled Karen's Water Collection. On the table were glitter-coated hoses, old garden gnomes, a few novelty spigots I'd modified to spray foam, and a framed picture of her blue roses from the infamous morning meltdown. Neighbors came by in droves. People who never used to socialize stopped to browse, laugh, and swap Karen stories. One man even bought a blue-stained watering can as a gift for his sister, calling it a cursed relic of Elmwood history. By now, my legend had spread. A few people in the area started calling me the Hose Whisperer or Glitter Avenger. Someone anonymously left a small trophy on my porch. It was shaped like a faucet and read Water Rights Defender at 2025. I kept it on a shelf next to my lawn camera monitor. The new HOA president, Phil, officially announced a revision to the rules during the next meeting. Gone were Karen's endless mandates about paint shades, wind chimes, and the perimeter visibility ordinance. In their place were more practical, reasonable guidelines, and a very clear rule about never, under any circumstances, tapping into another resident's water supply. At the end of the meeting, Phil handed me a certificate, just a joke, but still commemorating exceptional civic mischief in defense of personal plumbing. Karen's house didn't sell right away. Word had gotten around. Potential buyers would pull up, take one look at the slightly blue-streaked front lawn, then drive off slowly. A few even asked neighbors if the glitter story was true. Eventually, someone bought it, a young couple who showed up with rescue dogs and an aura of chaotic energy that seemed oddly perfect. I met them during their move-in day. They introduced themselves, laughed when I pointed out the old hose scars in the soil, and told me they were planning to install a koi pond. When I warned them that the ground had a colorful history, they just smiled and said, "Sounds fun." That was when I knew the war was truly over. I stood on my porch that night, watching the lights flicker in their kitchen, and took a deep breath of clean, dye-free air. My garden had recovered. No more mystery foam. No more sabotage. Just green, peaceful growth and the occasional butterfly flitting across my fence. I kept the camera, of course. You never know when another HOA tyrant might rise. But for now, things were good. Sometimes, when I'm watering my flowers, legally, mind you, I glance at the house next door and remember the chaos. The midnight stakeouts, the concoctions, the blue petals, the Facebook memes. I remember the moment Karen screamed into the morning air as her garden turned into a performance piece. And I remember the best part of all, that every ounce of it happened because someone underestimated just how far I was willing to go to protect my hose. Karen thought she was dealing with a pushover. She thought a little water theft and some vine warfare would go unnoticed. She never expected glitter. She never expected city code. And she certainly never expected a neighborhood that would rise up with lawn chairs and popcorn to see her rain come crashing down. She's gone now. The grass is greener. The hoses are locked. And peace, sweet, ridiculous peace, finally reigns in Elmwood Estates.